That ugly stack of rocks is coming down, Mr. Callahan, or I'll have it torn down myself and bill you for the privilege, lean your house, and see you on the street. The voice, a syrupy blend of suburban entitlement and unfiltered malice, belonged to Karen Vance, the newly crowned president of the Oak Ridge Preserve Homeowners Association. She stood on my pristine lawn, her floral print muumuu, a vibrant, jarring splash of color against the manicured green. Her arms were crossed over a chest that seemed to be in a constant state of puffed-up indignation, and her eyes, narrowed into judgmental slits, were fixed not on me, but on the formidable, moss-covered retaining wall that separated my property from the three homes perched precariously on the hill behind it. The wall was a masterpiece of old-world engineering, nearly 100 feet long and 12 feet high at its center, built from massive interlocking blocks of granite that looked like they'd been quarried from the heart of the mountain itself. It was the reason I'd bought the house. For Karen, it was an eyesore, a violation, an affront to the beige, cookie-cutter aesthetic she championed with the zeal of a petty dictator. To me, it was the only thing keeping her backyard, and two others, from sliding down the steep grade and joining me for an uninvited visit in my living room. Her threat hung in the humid afternoon air, as thick and unpleasant as the cheap perfume wafting from her. This wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration of war. This is the kind of neighborhood nightmare you read about online, the kind that makes you thank your lucky stars you don't live under the thumb of an HOA. If you've got your own story of a power-tripping board member or a ridiculous violation notice, drop it in the comments below. I want to hear where you're watching from and know I'm not alone in this fight. And make sure you subscribe, because you are not going to want to miss how this ends. Now back to that Tuesday afternoon that changed everything. Before Karen and her reign of terror, my life here was the quiet dream I'd promised myself after 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. I'd spent 2 decades managing massive construction projects in places where the ground was actively trying to kill you, from shoring up bases in the shifting sands of Iraq to building bridges over flood-swollen rivers in Southeast Asia. I understood soil mechanics, hydrology, and the unforgiving power of gravity better than most people understand their own checking accounts. When I retired, all I wanted was a piece of land where the only thing I had to manage was my own peace and quiet. This house, tucked at the bottom of a gentle slope in a secluded corner of the subdivision, was perfect. My wife, Sarah, fell in love with the garden space, and I fell in love with the wall. I saw it on the initial walkthrough and knew instantly it wasn't some decorative landscaping feature. It was a serious, structural necessity. The developer hadn't just stacked some rocks, they'd built a gravity retaining wall, a work of art designed to hold back thousands of tons of earth. The property surveys and original building plans, which I'd insisted on getting copies of at closing, confirmed it. The wall was listed as a critical load-bearing structure on the geotechnical report. It was the bedrock, literally, of the entire hillside development. For 3 years, it had been nothing more than a beautiful, silent guardian at the edge of my property. Kids from the neighborhood, including Karen's own grandson, used to hunt for lizards in its crevices. It was part of the landscape, as permanent as the old oaks that gave the community its name. But then the old HOA president, a reasonable retired accountant named George, moved away to be closer to his grandkids. In the ensuing power vacuum, Karen Vance, a woman whose only notable skill was complaining at board meetings, had seized control. Her platform was simple: restore the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity, which was code for harassing anyone whose property didn't conform to her bland, uninspired vision. And from her perch on the hill, my magnificent, functional, and utterly essential wall was her primary target. After she delivered her ultimatum on my lawn, I simply looked at her, my face a mask of calm I'd perfected in far more dangerous confrontations. "You do what you think you have to, Karen," I said, my voice even, "and I'll do what I know I have to." I turned without another word and walked back into my house, the sound of her sputtering indignation following me like a foul odor. Sarah was standing by the window, her face pale with worry. "Jack, what are you going to do? She sounds serious." I pulled the thick file of closing documents from our office cabinet and laid it on the kitchen table. "I'm going to let her," I said, tapping the bound engineering report. "I'm going to let her bury herself." The official notice arrived 2 days later, a crisp white envelope delivered by certified mail. It was a formal demand. Remove the non-compliant, unapproved rock structure at the rear of your property within 30 days, or the association will contract for its removal at the homeowner's expense. It cited a vague bylaw about unapproved landscaping modifications. The war had officially begun, not with a bang, but with the crisp, bureaucratic rustle of paper. And I, a man who had spent his life building things, was now being ordered to tear down the single most important structure in the entire neighborhood. I spent the next morning in my home office, a space usually dedicated to my woodworking hobbies and fly tying, but now transformed into a command center. The official notice from the HOA sat under a heavy glass paperweight, as if its malevolent energy needed to be physically contained. My first move wasn't to fire off an angry email or make a furious phone call. In the military, the first response to an attack is to gather intelligence, to understand the enemy's position, capabilities, and, most importantly, their weaknesses. Karen and the HOA were my new opposition force, and their letter was the opening salvo. I drafted a response, not with emotion, but with surgical precision. It was polite, professional, and utterly devoid of the anger simmering just below my surface. In the letter, I acknowledged receipt of their notice and respectfully requested 3 specific items. First, I asked for the exact date the unapproved landscaping modification was allegedly made, as my records indicated the structure predated the purchase of my home. Second, I requested a copy of the specific Architectural Review Committee (ARC) denial for the structure, as a violation of this nature would presuppose a request had been made and denied. Third, and most crucially, I asked for a copy of the official engineering report commissioned by the HOA that certified the slope's stability in the absence of the retaining wall. I knew with the certainty of a man who had built his career on such documents that they didn't have one. I sent the letter via certified mail with a return receipt requested, creating the first link in a long, unbreakable chain of evidence. While I waited for their inevitable non-answer, I began my own deep dive. I spread the original developer's blueprints and my property survey across the dining room table. The documents were a decade old, but the information was timeless. The contour lines on the survey map told a clear story, a steep 30-degree grade dropping from the properties on Ridgeback Lane directly down to my lot. The blueprints were even more explicit. Sheet C4, the grading and drainage plan, showed the retaining wall not as an aesthetic choice, but as a non-negotiable engineering requirement. A bold-faced note at the bottom of the page read, "Gravity retaining wall essential for slope stabilization and soil retention. For lots 18, 19, and 20. Do not remove or alter without consulting geotechnical engineer." Lot 19 belonged to Karen Vance. I took high-resolution photos of these documents with my phone and uploaded them to a secure cloud folder I labeled simply Project Bedrock. Next, I went outside with a tape measure, a camera, and a notepad. I documented the wall from every angle. I took pictures of the massive, well-seated base stones, the careful interlocking of the subsequent layers, and the integrated drainage pipes that prevented hydrostatic pressure from building up behind it. I photographed the visible signs of its immense burden, the slight, uniform bowing in the center, a testament to the thousands of tons of earth it held in check. I then walked up the hill to the street behind my house, Ridgeback Lane. From the public sidewalk, I took wide-angle shots showing the 3 houses, Karen's in the middle, flanked by the Millers and the Patels, and the steep drop-off of their backyards, a drop-off that was completely invisible from their perspective. Their manicured lawns ended, and the earth simply fell away, held in place by my wall. It was a textbook example of a cut-and-fill development, where the developer carves into a hillside to create flat building pads. It's a common practice, but it creates an artificial and inherently unstable slope that relies entirely on engineered solutions to prevent disaster. I documented the fine stress cracks in the concrete patio slab at the back of Karen's house, cracks that radiated from the edge of the slope. They were a silent scream, a geological warning that the ground here was not as stable as she believed. Everything was photographed, dated, and uploaded to Project Bedrock. The HOA's response arrived 10 days later. It was not the certified letter I was expecting, but a flimsy standard envelope with a second-class stamp. Inside was a form letter, a generic second notice of violation. It completely ignored my specific pointed questions. Instead, it simply stated that my failure to remedy the violation had resulted in the levying of a $100 fine, with further fines of $50 per day to be assessed until the unapproved structure was removed. It was signed not by a person, but with a sterile, impersonal stamp. Oak Ridge Preserve HOA Board. This was their strategy, not to engage with facts or logic, but to crush dissent under the weight of bureaucracy and financial pressure. They weren't interested in a dialogue. They were interested in compliance. They assumed I was like most homeowners, that I would grumble, maybe complain to a neighbor, and then ultimately cave to the threat of escalating fines and a lien on my home. They had severely miscalculated. This condescending, dismissive response was the second critical mistake Karen had made. Her first was threatening me. Her second was underestimating me. I scanned the new notice, uploaded it, and then picked up the phone. It was time to call in reinforcements. My first call wasn't to a lawyer, but to a brother in arms. Marcus Thorne had been my second in command in the Corps, a whip-smart civil engineer with a PhD from MIT and a cynical sense of humor that had gotten us through some hairy situations. He'd since retired and started his own successful engineering consultancy. I sent him the link to my Project Bedrock cloud folder. "Take a look when you have a minute, Mark," I said over the phone. "Got a little situation brewing with my HOA. An hour later, he called back. There was no preamble. "Jack, are these people clinically insane or just monumentally stupid?" I could hear him clicking through the images. "This isn't a landscaping wall, it's a primary earth retention system, based on these photos and the developer's original plans. Removing it isn't a code violation, it's an act of controlled demolition with an uncontrolled outcome. That slope has a surcharge from those three structures. You pull that wall, and you're not just getting dirt in your yard, you're getting their kitchens." His professional assessment confirmed what I already knew, but hearing it from an expert of his caliber solidified my resolve. "They're fining me $50 a day until I tear it down," I told him. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, then a low whistle. "Keep documenting everything, Jack. Every letter, every fine. Create a timeline. This isn't about a bylaw anymore. This is about gross negligence." Armed with Marcus's validation, I started to canvass my immediate neighborhood. But I did it quietly. I wasn't trying to start a rebellion, not yet. I was still in the intelligence gathering phase. I started with the Patels, a young couple with two small children who lived in one of the three houses directly above me. I found Mrs. Patel in her front yard, trying to wrangle a tricycle away from her toddler. I introduced myself and explained, in the calmest terms possible, that the HOA was pressuring me to remove the large stone wall at the bottom of the hill. I watched her face as the information registered. "The big wall? But doesn't that hold up our backyard?" she asked, her brow furrowed with a confusion that was quickly turning to concern. "That's my understanding," I said carefully. "I'm just trying to gather some information. Did the developer ever mention anything to you about the slope when you bought the house?" She shook her head. "No, nothing. The HOA documents are a mile thick. We probably just signed whatever was put in front of us. Karen Vance is the president now, right? She sent us a notice last month because our basketball hoop was visible from the street." The conversation was a small but significant victory. The Patels were now aware, and they were already primed to be skeptical of Karen's leadership. My next stop was Frank Miller's house, on the other side of Karen. Frank was a widower in his late 70s, a retired postal worker who had lived in the neighborhood since it was built. He was known for his prize-winning roses and his general desire to be left alone. I found him meticulously weeding his flower beds. When I brought up the wall, a flicker of fear crossed his face. "Oh, you don't want to get on the wrong side of Karen," he whispered, glancing nervously toward her house. "She's determined." I pressed gently, asking if he remembered the construction phase of the neighborhood. His eyes darted around. The developer, a fellow named McCluskey, he ran out of money halfway through. Cut a lot of corners on the last few houses up here on the ridge. I heard him arguing with the county inspector once. Something about the soil report and unforeseen instability. He put that big wall in right after. Said it was extra insurance. Frank's words were a bombshell. It suggested the developer knew the slope was even more unstable than the initial reports indicated, and that the wall was a last-minute, non-negotiable addition to prevent a potential catastrophe and secure his final permits. Frank, I said, my voice low and serious, did you ever get anything in writing about that? Any letters or notices from the developer? He looked terrified, shaking his head quickly. No, no, I don't want any trouble, Jack. I just want to tend my roses. Please don't mention I said anything. He scurried back toward his house, leaving me on the sidewalk. He was scared, but he had given me a critical piece of the puzzle. Motive. The developer wasn't just following a plan, he was correcting a problem. A problem the HOA, in its current state of arrogant ignorance, was about to recreate. The daily fines continued to accumulate. The total was now over $500. With the fines came a new letter, this one more menacing than the last. It was from the HOA's legal counsel, a local firm named Thatcher Smith & Kline. The letter was full of legal jargon, citing state statutes that gave HOAs the power to enforce covenants and place liens on property. It was designed to intimidate, to be the final blow that would force me to capitulate. It had the opposite effect. This escalation was exactly what I needed. They had moved the conflict from the realm of petty neighborhood disputes into the legal arena. And in that arena, their bluster and Karen's iron meant nothing. Facts were the only things that mattered, and I had them all on my side. The letter from their lawyer wasn't a threat, it was an invitation. An invitation to a fight they had no idea they were about to lose. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd gotten from a veterans support network. It was time to stop gathering intelligence and start planning my counterattack. So, let me get this straight, Mr. Callahan, said Elena Diaz, her office a testament to organized efficiency, a stark contrast to the chaotic mess of my dining room table. Files were perfectly aligned, pens were in their holder, and a single, formidable-looking orchid stood on the corner of her desk. She was a former JAG officer, and it showed. Her eyes, sharp and analytical, scanned the documents I had spread before her. My certified letters, the HOA's dismissive responses, the accumulating fine notices, the developer's plans, and the high-resolution photos of the wall and the precarious houses above it. The Homeowners Association, led by a woman whose house is directly supported by the structure in question, is ordering you to demolish that structure, citing a vague aesthetic bylaw. They have provided no engineering justification, ignored your formal requests for documentation, and are now fining you daily with the threat of a property lien for failing to comply with an order that would likely result in the catastrophic failure of their own properties. She leaned back in her chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. This is not a case, Mr. Callahan. This is a gift. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. For weeks, I had been operating in a state of controlled, isolated anger. Now I had an ally, and a formidable one at that. I thought so, I replied, but they have a law firm. They seem convinced they're on solid ground. They're on a sand dune, and the tide's coming in, she retorted, her fingers steepled. Their lawyer sent a standard-issue intimidation letter. It's boilerplate. It means they've spent maybe 30 minutes on this, assuming you're a typical, easily cowed homeowner. They haven't done their due diligence. You have. That's our advantage. Her strategy was immediate and twofold. First, she would handle the official legal response, putting the HOA and their counsel on formal notice. Second, she tasked me with a new mission, a deep dive into the county's public records. I want you to go to the county clerk's office, she instructed, and the planning and zoning department. I want every document related to the Oak Ridge Preserve development, original zoning applications, permits, inspection reports, certificates of occupancy, everything, especially anything related to the developer, McCluskey Development LLC. Frank's testimony about him running out of money is a critical lead. Developers in financial distress leave paper trails of desperation. The next day, I was at the county records office, a place that smelled of old paper and bureaucratic indifference. I spent hours sifting through microfiche and dusty binders. It was tedious work, but my military training had given me an almost infinite patience for methodical, detail-oriented tasks. And then I found it. It was in a thick file labeled Oak Ridge Preserve, Phase 2, Geotechnical Variance Requests. Tucked inside was a series of increasingly frantic letters between the developer, McCluskey, and the county's chief engineer. The first letter from the county noted that a routine soil density test on the upper ridge lots had failed, indicating unacceptable compaction and potential for long-term soil creep and subsidence. McCluskey's response was dismissive, blaming a faulty test. The county engineer's reply was ice-cold and non-negotiable. No further certificates of occupancy for lots 18, 19, or 20 will be issued until a revised, permanent slope stabilization plan is submitted, approved, and implemented. This was the smoking gun. McCluskey was stuck. He couldn't sell the houses he just built. The next document was McCluskey's revised plan. It included a detailed engineering diagram for a massive gravity retaining wall at the base of the slope. The final document in the file was the county's official approval, a stamped letter conditioning the issuance of the occupancy permits on the satisfactory construction and inspection of the specified earth retention system. The wall wasn't just a good idea, it was a legal prerequisite for the existence of those homes. The county had forced McCluskey to build it. I paid for certified copies of every single page. As I was packing up, a final search for McCluskey Development LLC yielded one more critical detail. The company had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy exactly 2 months after the final home in the subdivision was sold. In the chaotic handover, the newly formed HOA, likely run by a volunteer board with no expertise, had probably received a jumble of incomplete records. The crucial file on the wall's necessity, the one that proved it was a foundational piece of community infrastructure and not a private homeowner's landscaping modification, had been lost. Or perhaps it had been conveniently lost later by someone who didn't want the HOA to be on the hook for its long-term maintenance. I walked out of that county building and into the bright sunlight, the certified copies clutched in my hand like a winning lottery ticket. The HOA's case wasn't just weak, it was non-existent. They were ordering me to undo the very thing the county had mandated to ensure their safety. Back in Ms. Diaz's office, we laid the new documents next to the old ones. The picture was now complete and damning. "They have walked themselves into a cage and handed you the key," she said, her eyes gleaming. "Their legal position is utterly indefensible. Now, we don't just defend, we attack. It's time to set the trap." The strategy Ms. Diaz devised was a masterstroke of legal judo, a tactic designed to use the HOA's own aggressive momentum against them. It wasn't about proving them wrong in a courtroom months from now. It was about forcing them to confront the real-world consequences of their demands immediately. She called it strategic and malicious compliance. We drafted a new letter, this one far different from my initial polite inquiries. It was addressed to the entire HOA board of directors, personally, as well as to their legal counsel. The tone was one of reluctant capitulation. "After careful consideration of the association's persistent demands and escalating fines," the letter began, "and despite my belief that your position is factually and legally incorrect, I am prepared to comply with the order to remove the retaining wall structure." This opening was the bait. It was designed to appeal directly to Karen's ego, to make her believe she had finally broken me. It was a confession of defeat, a white flag. But the paragraphs that followed were the steel jaws of the trap. "However," the letter continued, "given the obvious structural nature of the wall and its clear role in supporting the properties located on lots 18, 19, and 20, its removal is an undertaking of significant risk. Therefore, my compliance is contingent upon the association's fulfillment of 2 simple, non-negotiable conditions. The first condition was the delivery of a signed and notarized hold, harmless, and indemnification agreement. This agreement, which Ms. Diaz drafted with gleeful precision, stipulated that the HOA, both as a corporate entity and as individual board members, would assume all and absolute liability for any and all damages resulting from the wall's removal. This included, but was not limited to, soil subsidence, landslides, structural damage to foundations, patios and dwellings, property value diminution, and the costs of any necessary remedial engineering and reconstruction. It explicitly named lots 18, 19, and 20 as the primary at-risk properties. In short, it stated, "You order it, you own the consequences. The second condition was that the HOA must commission, at their own expense, a new independent geotechnical survey and engineering report from a licensed and bonded firm. This report had to certify, unequivocally, that the slope would remain stable after the wall's removal and that the homes on Ridgeback Lane would be in no danger. A copy of this report, along with the firm's multi-million-dollar insurance binder, was to be provided to me before I would allow any demolition work to begin. We concluded the letter with a final, chillingly helpful offer. To expedite this process, I have already obtained quotes from 3 qualified demolition companies. The estimated cost for removal is approximately $45,000, an invoice for which I will gladly forward to the association upon receipt of the aforementioned documents. I look forward to resolving this matter and restoring your desired aesthetic to the community. We sent the package via courier with signature required to Karen's house, to the HOA's official address, and to the offices of Thatcher, Smith, and Klein. The effect, we hoped, would be like dropping a live grenade into their boardroom. Any sane person, any competent lawyer, would see the colossal, flashing red lights. They would see the immense liability and the impossible burden of proof we had just placed squarely on their shoulders. They would be forced to pause, to investigate, to realize the catastrophic mistake they were about to make. But my bet in Miss Diaz's was that Karen Vance was neither sane nor competent. She was an ideologue, blinded by a petty power struggle she had already won in her own mind. She wouldn't see a warning. She would see a trick. She wouldn't see liability. She would see my surrender. We didn't have to wait long. A week later, another letter from Thatcher, Smith, and Klein arrived. It was short, arrogant, and exactly what we had hoped for. The association rejects your frivolous and self-serving conditions, it stated. The demand for a hold harmless agreement is an admission of the structure's unauthorized nature. Your attempt to shift financial responsibility for the removal of your own violation is denied. They completely ignored the demand for an engineering report. It was an act of willful blindness so profound it was breathtaking. They had seen the trap, mistaken it for a victory arch, and marched right through it. The letter concluded with a final, fatal overreach. Be advised that if the structure is not removed within the next 15 days, the association will exercise its right to self-help, contract for the removal, and place a lien on your property for the full cost of the demolition, in addition to all outstanding fines and legal fees. They were going to do it. They were actually going to tear down the wall. Ms. Diaz read the letter in her office, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. They did it, she said softly. They actually put it in writing. They formally rejected their one and only chance to avoid liability. Now we let them hire the executioner. Karen, flushed with her perceived victory, moved with astonishing speed. Within a week, a notice was posted on the community bulletin board and slipped under my door. It announced that remedial landscaping work would be performed on my property line on a specific date, just 10 days away. The contractor was listed as Ace Demolition and Hauling. Karen had called my bluff, or so she thought. She was parading her triumph around the neighborhood, telling anyone who would listen how she had finally forced the stubborn veteran to comply with the rules. Her smug satisfaction was a tangible thing, a foul energy that seemed to emanate from her house on the hill. But her victory lap was premature. She had hired a demolition crew, but she had no idea that we were about to disarm them. Ms. Diaz drafted another letter, this one addressed not to the HOA, but directly to Mr. Stan Gable, the owner of Ace Demolition and Hauling. It was a masterpiece of polite, professional intimidation. It began by acknowledging their contract with the Oak Ridge Preserve, HOA, to remove a stone structure. It then methodically laid out the facts. We included the county-certified documents proving the wall was a legally mandated safety structure. We included my unanswered request for an engineering report. We included the HOA's formal rejection of a hold harmless agreement. The key passage was this: we are putting you and your company on formal notice that the structure you have been contracted to remove is a critical earth retention system. Its removal without a prior geotechnical study guaranteeing slope stability is an act of extreme negligence that will likely result in catastrophic property damage to the homes located at addresses of Karen's, the Millers, and the Patels' houses. Be advised that since the HOA has refused to accept liability, any and all damages will be pursued directly against the party physically causing them, namely your company. Our client, Mr. Callahan, has meticulously documented this entire situation, and we are fully prepared to file a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against Ace Demolition and Hauling for reckless endangerment and property destruction the moment your equipment touches that wall. To drive the point home, we included a link to the Project Bedrock folder, giving Stan Gable full access to the photos, blueprints, and county records. We sent it to his office via courier, ensuring he would have it in his hands by the start of the next business day. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Is this Jack Callahan?" a gruff voice asked. "This is Stan Gable from Ace Demolition. I got a letter from your lawyer." "I thought you might," I replied calmly. "Listen," he said, his voice a mixture of anger and panic. "What the hell is going on? That crazy HOA lady told me this was a simple teardown of some illegal landscaping. Your lawyer's letter? Are you serious? A landslide?" "As serious as a heart attack, Mr. Gable," I said. "I'm an engineer. I know what that wall is holding back. The HOA is operating on pure ignorance and arrogance. They refuse to listen." There was a string of curses on the other end of the line. "They didn't give me any of this. They just said you were being difficult. A multi-million-dollar lawsuit? My insurance would drop me in a heartbeat for a job this reckless. We're out. I'm not touching that wall. I'm not going out of business for some power-tripping condo commando." He hung up. An hour later, I saw Karen's car screech to a halt in front of my house. She stormed up to my door, her face a mask of purple rage, and began hammering on it with her fist. I didn't answer. I just watched her through the peephole, a wild animal who had just seen her prey vanish. She screamed my name. She screamed about contracts and lawsuits, her voice echoing through the quiet cul-de-sac. It was the sound of a bully who had just been punched in the mouth for the first time. Her plan was unraveling. The public spectacle of her meltdown at my front door was the first crack in her armor. Neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains. The Patels from their house up the hill had a clear view of the entire pathetic display. The tide was beginning to turn, but I wasn't done. The next phase of the plan was to take the fight public. Ms. Diaz had a contact at a local TV news station, an investigative reporter named Cynthia Wu, who had a reputation for championing the underdog against faceless bureaucracies. We gave her the entire Project Bedrock folder. The story was irresistible. Decorated veteran bullied by HOA, ordered to destroy wall holding up president's own home. Cynthia Wu's eyes lit up when we explained the malicious compliance strategy and the demolition company's withdrawal. The irony was too delicious to ignore. 2 days after Karen's tantrum, Cynthia Wu's news van was parked on the street in front of my house. Karen, seeing the van, made another fatal error. Instead of hiding, she stormed out of her house and marched down the hill to confront the news crew, ready to give her side of the story. It was a gift from the heavens. The camera was rolling as she launched into a tirade about disrespectful homeowners, property values, and ugly, non-compliant structures. Cynthia Wu, a master of her craft, let her talk, patiently holding the microphone as Karen dug her own grave on camera. Then Cynthia calmly asked the question we had prepped. "Ms. Vance, we have county documents here that show this wall is a legally required safety structure, mandated by the county to prevent your own home from sliding down this hill. Were you aware of that?" The camera zoomed in on Karen's face. The arrogant certainty drained away, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then panic. She stared at the documents Cynthia held out. That's not possible," she stammered. They must be fake." It was a disastrous, career-ending performance, and it was about to be broadcast on the 6 o'clock news. The news segment aired that evening, and the effect was like a detonation in the heart of the community. Cynthia Wu had masterfully woven the narrative, contrasting my calm, fact-based interview with Karen's sputtering, unhinged tirade. She showed the county documents, the blueprints, and an animated graphic illustrating what would happen to the 3 houses on Ridgeback Lane if the wall were removed. The segment ended with a shot of Karen's face, frozen in a mask of disbelief as she was confronted with the truth. My phone started ringing almost immediately. It was neighbor after neighbor, many of whom I barely knew. "We saw the news, Jack. We had no idea. That woman is out of control. We got a violation last month because our garden hose was visible. My husband is on the architectural committee. He had no idea about any of this." Karen pushed the violation through herself, said it was a fast-track issue. It turned out that Karen had been running the HOA like her own personal fiefdom, bypassing procedures, intimidating other board members, and unilaterally issuing violations. My case wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the most egregious example. The story had given them courage. The next morning, I found a plain manila envelope on my doorstep. Inside was an anonymous note and a stack of papers. The note said, "Thought you should see this. Good luck." The papers were copies of internal HOA emails from the past year. They showed Karen systematically overruling the architectural committee, bullying the treasurer into approving funds for her pet projects, and directing the HOA's lawyer to pursue homeowners with a vindictiveness that shocked even me. The most damning email was one where she instructed the board secretary to archive and dispose of old developer files from the storage unit to reduce clutter, specifically mentioning a box labeled geotechnical and zoning variances. She hadn't just lost the documents. She had intentionally destroyed the evidence that proved the wall was the HOA's responsibility. This was no longer just gross negligence. This was fraud and destruction of evidence. But the most important development came from the most unlikely source, Frank Miller. He appeared at my door that afternoon, clutching a faded yellowed envelope. His hands were trembling, but his eyes were resolute. "I saw the news," he said, his voice stronger than I had ever heard it. "She can't be allowed to do this. I was scared, Jack. I'm sorry. But my wife, God rest her soul, she kept everything." He handed me the envelope. Inside was a letter dated 10 years ago from McCluskey Development LLC, addressed to the original homeowners of lots 18, 19, and 20. It was a form letter, but its contents were explosive. It explained that due to unforeseen soil conditions, a structural retaining wall had been built, and that the long-term integrity of your property is dependent on its maintenance. It went on to state that responsibility for this maintenance would be transferred to the Oak Ridge Preserve HOA as part of the common area infrastructure. Frank had kept his copy. It was the missing link, the final, irrefutable proof that the wall was not mine to remove, but the HOA's to maintain. The anonymous emails proved Karen's cover-up, and Frank's letter proved the original intent. The community, which had been fractured and fearful, was beginning to coalesce. An emergency community meeting was called by several other board members who were now in full-blown panic mode. The flyer announcing it was posted on the same bulletin board where Karen had announced her remedial landscaping. This time the subject wasn't a violation, it was the future of the board of directors. The meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday in the community clubhouse. I knew this would be the final battlefield. I called Ms. Diaz. "We have everything," I said. "It's time to end this." She agreed. "Be there on Wednesday, Jack. Bring your documents. I'll be there too. And I'm not coming to negotiate." The stage was set for a public execution. Karen had wanted a war over a pile of rocks. She was about to get one she would never forget, fought not with demolition equipment, but with projectors, certified letters, and the collective anger of a neighborhood that had finally had enough. The community clubhouse, usually reserved for potlucks and children's birthday parties, was packed. The air was thick with tension and the low murmur of anxious chatter. Every seat was taken, and residents stood 3 deep along the walls. At the front of the room, behind a folding table, sat the HOA board of directors. Karen was in the center, her face a stony mask of defiance, but the bravado was gone. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, unable to meet the hostile gazes of her neighbors. The other 4 board members looked like they were facing a firing squad. I sat in the front row with Sarah, a thick binder on my lap. Ms. Diaz sat beside me, her leather briefcase on the floor next to her chair, looking as calm as if she were waiting for a bus. Cynthia Wu and her cameraman were set up discreetly in the back, a promise I had made to her for breaking the story. Karen banged a flimsy gavel on the table. "This emergency meeting has been called to address recent misinformation," she began, her voice strained. There have been baseless accusations made against the board, and I want to assure everyone that we have always acted in the best interests of the community. She tried to launch into a prepared speech about property values and aesthetic harmony, but she was immediately shouted down. "What about the wall, Karen?" Someone yelled from the back. "Did you try to make that man tear down a wall that holds up your own house? Did you lie on the news?" shouted another. The room erupted. The gavel was useless against the tide of anger. Karen's face flushed a deep mottled red. "This is not how we conduct meetings," she screeched. "There are rules of order." That's when I stood up. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me. "You're right, Karen," I said, my voice carrying easily through the hall. "There are rules, there are also facts." I walked to the front of the room, where a projector and screen had been set up at my request. I opened my binder. "For the past 2 months," I began, "I have been trying to have a factual conversation with this board. They have refused, so I'll have it with all of you instead." For the next 20 minutes, I laid out the entire case, methodically and dispassionately. I projected the developer's blueprints, the contour maps, the county-mandated variance approvals. I showed them the pictures of the stress cracks on Karen's patio. I put up my letters to the board and their dismissive, threatening responses. The room was utterly silent, captivated. Then I projected Frank Miller's letter from the developer. A collective gasp went through the crowd. "This letter," I said, "sent to the original owners of the homes on the ridge, proves that the wall was always intended to be a common structure, maintained by the HOA. It is not, and has never been, my personal property or my responsibility." Finally, I put up the anonymous emails, with the key phrases highlighted. The one where Karen ordered the disposal of the geotechnical files. The mood in the room shifted from anger to cold fury. They weren't just looking at incompetence anymore. They were looking at a deliberate, malicious cover-up. Karen jumped to her feet. "This is an illegal proceeding. These documents they're taken out of context. You can't just..." Her tirade was cut short as Miss Diaz stood and walked calmly to the front. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "My name is Elena Diaz. I am Mr. Callahan's legal counsel." She turned to face the board. "The documents you see are all certified public records or have been authenticated. They are evidence of gross negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, and likely criminal fraud and destruction of records." She opened her briefcase and pulled out 5 thick envelopes. "Karen Vance, Marcus Cole, Jennifer Swain, Robert Bell, and Lisa Chen," she said, reading the names of each board member. "As of this moment, you are all being served with a notice of intent to sue. We will be seeking damages for the harassment of my client, for the attempted illegal enforcement of covenants, and for the willful endangerment of the residents of this community. Furthermore," she continued, her voice dropping, "we will be filing a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office, recommending a criminal investigation into the board's fraudulent activities." She placed an envelope in front of each board member. The color drained from their faces. The husbands of the other 2 women on the ridge, Mr. Patel and Mr. Miller, were on their feet, their faces masks of horror as they finally truly understood that their homes had been put at risk. Karen stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. Her reign was over. Her authority had evaporated. In a single devastating public forum, she had been stripped of her power, exposed as a fraud, and threatened with financial and legal ruin. She sank back into her chair, no longer a tyrant, just a defeated old woman in a room full of people who now despised her. The reversal was absolute. The fallout from the meeting was swift and brutal. The HOA board imploded overnight. An emergency session was held the very next day, a session to which I was pointedly invited as an observer. It took place not in the public clubhouse, but in the cramped, airless office of the HOA's lawyers, Thatcher, Smith, and Klein. The atmosphere was funereal. The firm's senior partner, a man with the weary expression of someone who had seen it all, was present. He had clearly been briefed and was in full damage control mode. The board members, minus Karen, who had refused to attend, sat huddled together, looking shell-shocked and betrayed. The lawyer didn't mince words. He informed them that their directors' and officers' insurance policy, the thing that was supposed to protect them from personal liability, was likely void due to their willful and grossly negligent acts. He explained that ignoring documented safety warnings and ordering the destruction of a critical structure was not something an insurance company would cover. They were on their own. The panic in their eyes was palpable. The first order of business was a unanimous vote to demand Karen Vance's immediate resignation from the board. The second was a vote to rescind, with prejudice, every fine, violation notice, and legal threat ever issued against me. The third was to draft a formal resolution to be recorded in the county records, officially acknowledging the retaining wall as a critical common area structure and accepting full responsibility for its perpetual inspection, maintenance, and repair. Within an hour, everything I had been fighting for was codified into official HOA policy. As the meeting concluded, the senior partner from the law firm approached me. "Mr. Callahan," he said, extending a hand I did not take, "on behalf of the association, I want to offer our sincerest apologies. This situation was mishandled." "It wasn't mishandled," I said, my voice cold. "It was malicious. Your firm sent me a letter threatening to lien my house for not complying with an order that would have destroyed 3 others. You're as culpable as they are." His face tightened, but he nodded. "Point taken. We will also be reviewing our relationship with the Oak Ridge Preserve HOA." In other words, they were about to fire their most toxic and now insolvent client. News of Karen's public humiliation and subsequent ousting spread like wildfire. She became a pariah in her own neighborhood. People would cross the street to avoid her. The friendly waves she had once demanded as her due were replaced with stony glares. Her husband, a quiet accountant who seemed to have been a passive spectator to his wife's reign, suddenly looked 10 years older. Their for sale sign went up less than a month later. It was a quiet, ignominious retreat, but the most satisfying moment of vindication came in the form of a phone call about 2 weeks after the board meeting. The caller identified himself as a senior engineer from a large, reputable geotechnical firm. "Mr. Callahan, I've been hired by your HOA to conduct a full structural assessment of a large retaining wall on your property line. They, seem to have lost the original plans and surveys. They said you might have a copy?" The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. The very people who had denied the wall's importance and ordered its destruction were now desperately in need of the documents I had preserved, documents they had tried to have destroyed. "I might," I said, allowing myself a small, grim smile. "I'll be happy to provide them. For a consulting fee, of course." There was a brief, surprised silence on the other end of the line. "Of course," the engineer finally said. The new chastened HOA board, now led by a level-headed architect from another part of the neighborhood, approved my invoice without a word. They also paid Miss Diaz's legal fees in full as part of a settlement to avoid the lawsuit she had threatened. The financial cost of their arrogance was beginning to add up. They paid for the geotechnical survey, they paid for my consulting, they paid my lawyer, and the survey's results were sobering. My friend Marcus had been right. The wall was under immense strain. Years of neglect and increased water runoff from new patio installations on the ridge had increased the hydrostatic pressure. The engineering firm recommended immediate, extensive remediation, including installing new tiebacks and improving the drainage system. The estimated cost was north of $80,000. It was a bitter pill for the community to swallow, a massive expenditure that could have been avoided with basic, competent governance. The cost was levied as a special assessment on all homeowners, a stark and expensive reminder of the price of letting a bully take the wheel. Karen had tried to saddle me with a $45,000 demolition bill and ruin me with fines. Instead, her actions had cost every one of her neighbors and herself a share of a much larger and truly necessary expense. Months slid by and a sense of normalcy, a better version of it, began to settle over Oak Ridge Preserve. The scars of the conflict were healing, but the lessons had been learned. The new HOA board operated with a transparency that was almost painful. Every decision was debated openly, minutes were published immediately, and a new advisory committee for infrastructure was formed. I was asked to chair it. I accepted. It wasn't about power, it was about stewardship. It was about making sure that a handful of people with a petty agenda could never again hold the safety and well-being of the entire community hostage. The work on the retaining wall began in the early fall. A crew of professionals, not demolition men, descended with sophisticated equipment. They drilled into the face of the wall, inserting long steel tiebacks that anchored deep into the bedrock of the hillside. They installed a new state-of-the-art drainage system behind the wall, relieving the pressure that had been building for years. It was a noisy, messy process, but no one complained. The sound of the drills was the sound of security, of a problem being fixed correctly. I would often stand in my backyard with a cup of coffee, watching them work. The wall, my old stone guardian, was being reinforced, its strength renewed. It was no longer a point of contention, but a monument to the community's ordeal and its eventual triumph. It stood as a silent, powerful testament to the fact that truth, backed by meticulous documentation and unwavering resolve, would always win out over arrogant ignorance. Frank Miller became a new man. Freed from the fear of Karen's retribution, he blossomed. He started a neighborhood gardening club and would often stop by to chat, his earlier timidity replaced by a quiet confidence. The Patels, the young couple from up the hill, baked us a thank you cake. "We had no idea what was at stake," Mr. Patel told me, shaking my hand. "You saved our home, Jack." Truly. The sense of community, once fractured by suspicion and fear, was now stronger than ever. We had been through a fire together and come out tempered on the other side. Karen and her husband finally sold their house at a significant loss. The stigma attached to the property and the looming special assessment for the wall repair had made it a hard sell. I saw them on their moving day. Their faces were grim. Karen wouldn't look at me, but her husband gave me a short, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, a recognition of the forces his wife had unleashed and the quiet man who had turned them back against her. One crisp autumn afternoon, long after the construction crews had gone and the new grass had started to grow over the disturbed earth near the wall, I received one last piece of correspondence related to the affair. It wasn't a legal notice or an HOA flyer. It was a formal letter from the county engineer's office. "Dear Mr. Callahan," it began, "it has come to our attention through media reports and subsequent inquiries into the Oak Ridge Preserve HOA that your actions were instrumental in preventing a potentially catastrophic infrastructure failure. Your diligence in preserving original development records and your steadfast refusal to comply with a dangerously misguided order from your HOA board are to be commended. You have performed a significant public service." The letter was a final official vindication. It wasn't just a victory over a neighborhood bully. It was recognition from the highest authority that I had been right, not just legally, but morally and technically. I framed that letter and hung it in my office, right next to a picture of the newly reinforced wall. Sarah and I were in the backyard one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky. The wall stood behind us, solid and unmovable, its mossy stones catching the last golden rays of light. It was no longer just a structure of rock and engineering. It was a symbol of the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground, the importance of fighting for what's right, and the deep, satisfying justice of watching a tyrant be undone, not by brute force, but by the inescapable gravity of their own foolishness. The peace I had sought in retirement, the peace Karen had tried to shatter, had finally been secured, and it was as solid as the stone at my back.